haunting presence lurks beneath London's grandest stage, waiting. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments make every mystery feel shared. Now let's dive in. In glancing back over the strange skein of events which I am about to set down, I am conscious of a reluctance that is not wholly literary. There are cases even now which I would willingly consign to the oblivion of my dispatch box, not from any failing in my memory of them, but because the recollection carries with it a certain chill, as of a draught passing suddenly across the hearth on a winter's evening. It is not the horror of crime alone which produces such an effect, for I have seen too much of mankind's darker doings at my friend's side to be readily shaken by mere atrocity. Rather, it is the sense of something cunning and intimate in the evil, something that insinuates itself into places where music should reign, where gentility is presumed inviolate, and where one comes to forget for a while the vulgar pressures of the world. The opera, said Sherlock Holmes once, with that odd half-smile which meant he was about to be paradoxical, is civilization pretending for a few hours that it has no cellar. I did not then comprehend the full meaning of his remark. I came to do so later, when the cellars of the Royal Lyceum revealed to us a mystery as deep as any London sewer, and a shadow that had no business to lie beneath so noble a roof. It was in the latter days of November 1894 that the affair opened. A raw fog had come rolling up from the river, and had settled on the town like a grey blanket steeped in soot. It pressed against the windows of our sitting-room in Baker Street, dimming the familiar outlines of the room until even the Persian slipper upon the mantel and the old chemical apparatus on the side table seemed dreamlike. Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa in a long, lean line, his hands clasped behind his head, and his eyes half closed in that attitude of languid repose which I knew so well to be but the shell of his most alert concentration. A violin lay open upon his knee, though he had not drawn the bow for a quarter of an hour. Every now and then his fingers would tap lightly upon the wood, as if marking an unheard rhythm. I had been engaged in the more prosaic occupation of sorting some notes upon a case of pneumonia, when a sharp peal of the bell below cut through the quiet. Holmes opened his eyes as a hound pricks its ears at a distant cry. "A client," said he simply. "You could tell that by the bell?" I asked. "By your paper knife," he returned without moving. "You have been cutting old envelopes with the edge worn to a crescent. The last time you did so was this very morning, for you were in haste to open a letter. You have since been at leisure. Therefore the bell cannot be the postman. If it were a tradesman, Mrs. Hudson would anticipate him. This bell is sharp and peremptory. A client, Watson, unless the King of Bohemia has at last remembered his debts." I laughed, for the reference to that singular monarch brought back to us an earlier adventure, and I had risen to open the door when our landlady herself appeared, anxious and a little flurried. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says his business is of the utmost urgency." "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." An instant later there entered one of the most remarkable men I had ever seen, and I say this with no desire to court melodrama. His appearance struck me at once as incongruous with our modest rooms. He was tall and finely made, perhaps a trifle over 30, with the pallor of one who lives more under gaslight than under the sun. His clothes were of excellent cut, of that subdued splendour which marks the man who can afford the best, but sees no reason to shout it. Yet for all his elegance, there was a certain wildness about him which no tailor could conceal. His dark hair was brushed back from a high forehead, in which care had cut 2 deep lines. His moustache was trimmed with punctilious neatness, but his hands, white, Long-fingered hands, such as might belong to a pianist, trembled as he removed his hat. His eyes were the chief point of attention. They were large, a deep hazel, almost black in some lights, and they had that feverish brightness which suggests either illness or an imagination lately taxed beyond endurance. Holmes rose with the ease of a panther and waved him to the armchair opposite. "You have come from the Lyceum," said he. The gentleman started and stared. "Good God!" he cried. "How could you know that?" "My dear sir, the fog has not penetrated my nose. You bring with you the faint odour of grease paint and rosin. There is a speck of gold leaf upon your left cuff, such as is used in decorative scenery. Your boots have the fine black dust of stage boards, not the gritty mud of the streets. Lyceum, without question. But pray be seated. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely." The man sank into the chair as though his legs had failed him. For a moment he pressed a hand to his brow and made an evident effort to compose himself. "My name is Adrian Lascelles," said he at last. "I was musical director to the Royal Lyceum Opera Company." Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Was?" Lascelles's throat worked convulsively. When he spoke again, his voice had thickened. "I resigned this morning. I was compelled to. God help me, Mr. Holmes, I am half mad between fear and shame. I hardly know how to set this matter before you." "Begin at the beginning," Holmes answered gently. "The beginning is always an excellent place." The young director passed a hand across his eyes and drew a deep breath. "Last night," said he, "we performed Don Giovanni. It was a full house. The Prince of Wales himself was in the royal box. I conducted as I have conducted 100 times before. The first act passed without incident. At the interval I went to my room behind the stage, to the little office where I keep my scores and notes. When I returned for the second act, the house was already humming. The curtain rose. We were perhaps 10 minutes into the act when the thing happened. He paused, his knuckles white upon the arms of the chair. The singer who played Donna Anna, Miss Eugenia Marchmont, was in the middle of her aria. She is a woman of great talent, Mr. Holmes, and her voice— well, I do not pretend to be impartial, for I have known her since we were children. She was magnificent. Then, without the least warning, she broke. Her voice stopped as if a cord had snapped. She put her hand to her throat, swayed, and fell forward upon the stage. "An attack of illness?" I ventured. "No, not illness." Lascelles' eyes fixed upon me with a haunted intensity. "She was dead before the audience had ceased applauding. They thought it was part of the acting. God forgive them for their ignorance. It was only when the tenor bent to lift her that he sprang back with a cry. There was blood upon her lips. Her face had already begun to turn blue." "Poison," said Holmes very quietly. "Yes." The man's voice dropped into a whisper. "Poison, Mr. Holmes, swift and dreadful. The doctors of the theatre were called at once. There was nothing to be done. She died there, under the gaslights, to the sound of the orchestra." I felt a tightening at my heart. There is something peculiarly pitiful in the sudden extinction of life amid those artificial splendours which are meant to imitate passion without truly touching it. The notion of death standing coldly upon a stage while men in costume sing around it struck me as grotesque beyond words. Holmes did not move, only his eyes grew more intent. "You told the police?" "Lestrade was there within an hour. He turned the house upside down. He examined the dressing rooms, questioned the chorus, searched for any bottle or powder. They found nothing at all." Lascelles' hands spread helplessly. "The body was taken away. There will be an inquest this afternoon." And you resigned this morning because... Lascelles' composure broke. He leaned forward, his voice shaking. Because they found this in my desk. From the inner pocket of his coat, he drew a folded paper. I observed that his fingers clung to it as if it burned him. He held it out to Holmes, who opened it with that deliberate care which was the mark of his respect for all evidence, no matter how small. It was a sheet of ivory notepaper of fine quality. Across it, in a firm, slanting hand, were written a few lines. Holmes read them once, and then passed the paper to me. I reproduced the note exactly as it was. Mr. Lascelles, you have conducted your last performance. The Lyceum keeps its secrets beneath the boards. If you value your life, leave by dawn. S. Watson's margin of scepticism, I confess, is wide, but even to me there was something chilling in the very calmness of that threat. I looked up. Was it in your handwriting? I asked, involuntarily. No, cried Lascelles with passion. No, on my honour, it was not there when I left my room at the interval. I locked the desk, only I have the key. Yet when we returned, after the catastrophe, the note was lying upon my scores as plainly as if a hand had put it there in my presence. And Lestrade believes, said Holmes, that I did it, that I poisoned her. The man's voice went hollow. He is courteous enough to say he has not yet formed a conclusion, but he watches me as a cat watches a mouse. The management murmurs, the company whispers. I saw it in their eyes this morning. I felt it in the way they stepped aside. I am disgraced, Mr. Holmes. Worse, she is dead. He buried his face in his hands. For a moment we were silent, save for the muffled rumble of London outside. Holmes's face had grown very grave. Few men understood so well as he the agony of a wrongly suspected mind. Yet his next remark was characteristic. "You are omitting something," said he. Lascelles looked up, stricken. "I am omitting nothing. You are omitting what you have not yet told yourself. There is a detail which has held you by the throat since last night, and you are trying not to name it. Pray do not flatter yourself that it can be hidden from me. What did she say to you at the interval?" The colour drained from Lascelles' cheeks. He stared at Holmes as if at an apparition. "How could you know that she spoke to me?" "Because you have a thread of white silk upon your right lapel, torn, not cut. Such silk is used only in ladies' evening gloves. One does not acquire it by leaning on a banister. It is the token of a quick grasp. The person who grasped you was agitated. Who but Miss Marchmont, in the moments before her death? Well?" The poor fellow's resistance collapsed. He sank back with a shiver. She came to me in my room during the interval," he said. "She was upset, terrified really. She closed the door behind her and said that she could not go on. She said that someone had been in her dressing room, that when she returned from the first act she found her mirror marked, scratched upon the glass with something sharp. There were words, Mr. Holmes." "What words?" "Only two, under you." Holmes's eyes narrowed by a fraction. She thought it was a jest at first, but then she saw that her costume had been disturbed. Her fan was not as she left it. The ribbon of her bodice had been retied. She had the feeling, she said so herself, that she was being watched from below. "From below?" Lascelles nodded miserably. "She told me she had heard a sound several times during rehearsal, faint, like a tapping or a scuffle under the boards, when she stood at a certain spot on the stage. Everyone laughed at her. They said the rats were getting theatrical, but she was not a fanciful woman, Mr. Holmes. She begged me to stop the performance. I tried to calm her. I said it was nerves, that the house was full, that she was overworked." He pressed his hands together. "I left her to compose herself. When the bell rang, she went back to her dressing room. I went to the pit. 10 minutes. Later she was dead. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. His manner had that deceptive languor which meant his mind was already racing. "Why did you not tell Lestrade this?" "Because it sounds mad," cried Lascelles. "Because under you—" "What does that mean? Under the stage? Under her? It would make me look like a conspirator in some melodrama. Lestrade would laugh, then he would suspect me more." Holmes's gaze softened a little. "Lestrade laughs at many things he afterward wishes he had examined. You did well to come to me. Then you will take the case?" "I will consider it." Lascelles sprang to his feet as if electrified. "Consider it? Mr. Holmes, a woman is dead, and I may hang." Holmes raised a hand. "Sit down, and do not waste your blood on exclamation. We will go to the Lyceum at once, but first, a matter of trifles." He turned to me, and there was a sudden gleam of amusement in his eyes. "Watson, you observe our visitor's right hand?" "Yes." "It is stained faintly at the cuticle with a greenish yellow. What does that suggest to you?" I examined the hand. The stain was indeed there, subtle but unmistakable. "I should say some chemical? Perhaps from ink?" "Not ink. Rosin, yes, but rosin does not stain green. Think of the theatre." I shook my head. Holmes smiled faintly and turned back to Lascelles. "Do you play billiards, Mr. Lascelles?" "No." "Do you handle copper coins excessively?" "Certainly not." "Then you have, since last night, handled verdigris. The Lyceum uses old brass fittings in its trap doors. Your hand has touched one recently. Unless I am mistaken, you have been under the stage this morning." Lascelles stared. "I went down there at dawn," he confessed. "I could not sleep. I remembered her words. I thought perhaps some stage hand had been making a tunnel to spy. I do not know. I went down alone with a lantern. I walked the service corridors under the boards." "And what did you find?" "Nothing," he said faintly. "Only darkness and dust. But the place is a maze. There are old cellars beyond the usual passages, parts of the building that no one uses. I didn't dare go far. The lantern! The air is foul. I heard noises, Mr. Holmes. I could swear I heard someone moving where there should be no one." Holmes rose, and in an instant the indolent dreamer was gone. In his place was the keen, restless man of action whom I had followed through so many adventures. He slipped on his coat and caught up his hat. "Come, Watson. Your medical bag, if you please. Mr. Lascelles, you will accompany us. If there is a shadow beneath the opera house, we may as well look it in the face before it looks at us." As we descended the stairs and stepped into the fog-bound street, I noted that Lascelles kept close to Holmes as a child keeps close to a strong man in the dark. I could not blame him. The air outside was thick and wet, and the gas lamps burned like blurred moons. The hansom that Holmes hailed loomed out of the grey with a ghostly suddenness, and the horses' hooves rang sharp upon the cobbles as we drove eastward toward Covent Garden. I remember, as we passed through streets half obliterated by fog, thinking how easily a man might vanish in such a London as this, and leave no trace but a footmark to be swallowed by the next rolling bank of mist. I did not then know how close that reflection lay to the very heart of the mystery, nor that within a few hours I should stand beneath the grand gilded ceiling of the Lyceum and feel, with a queer tightening of the skin, that the boards under my feet concealed more than ropes and pulleys. Holmes, sitting opposite me in the cab, had grown silent. His eyes were fixed, not upon the drifting shapes of the street, but inward, as if he saw instead some private diagram of cause and consequence unfolding in the dark of his mind. Once, when the cab jolted, he looked up and said, almost under his breath, "Under you. How very literal people can be when they are frightened." It was the last remark he made before we drew up at the stage door of the Royal Lyceum Opera House, and the case which I have called The Shadow Beneath the Opera House truly began. The stage door of the Lyceum admitted us into a world curiously divorced from the clamour outside. Even through the fog, one had heard the muffled rumble of traffic in Wellington Street, the occasional cry of a costermonger, the deep note of a passing omnibus. But here there was only a subdued stir, as in a great house after a bereavement. The gas in the corridor burned low, and the very smell of the place, paint, dust, stale velvet, and the peculiar warm odour of crowded humanity, seemed overlaid by something colder and sharper, as though death had left a trace more penetrating than any perfume. A sour-faced doorkeeper, who had evidently been primed with some warning as to our coming, led us without delay along a passage lined with scenery and into a small room close by the wings. It was Lascelles' office, the same of which he had spoken, and I could well believe that the memory of the past night must cling to it like a stain. Lestrade was already there. He rose from a chair near the desk, his thin, ferret-like face set in an expression of weariness which did not, however, conceal a certain satisfaction at having anticipated us. "Morning, Mr. Holmes, Doctor." He nodded to me and then to Lascelles, with a sort of embarrassed reserve. "You've been quick, sir. I heard you'd been sent for." "I am always quick when music is interrupted by murder," Holmes replied. "You have been equally prompt, I perceive." Lestrade's eyes flickered to the dead woman's photograph which lay upon the desk, and back again. "We do what we can. There's little enough to go on. I'd be glad of your help. It's a queer business. You have the advantage of me by several hours. Perhaps you will put me in possession of the known facts." Lestrade took up a notebook. "Miss Marple fell on the stage at 10 minutes past 9. She was dead before she was carried to the green room. Dr. Anstruther there says it's prussic acid, fast work. They've taken her costume, her gloves, her fan, everything for analysis. No bottle found in her room, no trace backstage. Her maid swears she took nothing between acts except a sip of water. That water's been brought away too. The chorus, stage hands, musicians, all were kept in the building till after 1 in the morning. We searched every likely nook, nothing." "And the note?" said Holmes. Lestrade glanced at Lascelles, and then spoke with a certain delicacy. "It was found on Mr. Lascelles's desk after the performance. He says he didn't write it, and didn't know it was there until then." "And you believe him?" Lestrade's mouth tightened. "I've learned not to believe anyone till I've tested 'em. Still, I'm not saying he did it. He had opportunities, that's all. He was alone in this room at the interval. He was close by her on the stage after. And, well, there's the matter we haven't talked about yet." Holmes's eyelids lowered. "The matter of motive?" Lestrade hesitated, then looked squarely at Lascelles. "There was talk, sir. A good deal of talk. You and Miss Marple were thought to be close." The young director flushed a dull red. "We were engaged," he said hoarsely. "We had not made it public." Lestrade tapped his pencil. "There you are. A quarrel, jealousy, high words. The public will have it that a man doesn't poison the woman he loves, but the public is a fool, Mr. Holmes. I've seen queer turns of passion in my time." Holmes held up the note between his long fingers as though it were a moth pinned to card. "This is not passion," said he quietly, "nor is prussic acid a lover's weapon. It is too swift, too exact, too impersonal. A man who kills thus has a plan, not a temper." Lestrade shrugged. "Plans can grow out of tempers. But I'm not here to quarrel. You want to see the place where she fell?" "At once." We passed through the wing and out upon the stage, which, stripped now of its scenery, looked bare and rather melancholy under the daylight filtering from the high windows of the roof. A few gas jets still hissed faintly, burning though no audience watched them. Scattered about were coils of rope, a carpenter's trestle, and a mask left carelessly upon a chair. Two men in shirt-sleeves were sweeping, and paused to stare at our little party, as if we were intruding upon a sacred space. Holmes walked to the very spot where Lascelles indicated the singer had stood. A large chalk mark upon the boards showed where her body had lain before it was lifted. "Here," said Lascelles, his voice barely above a whisper. She was facing the pit, her left shoulder a little forward. So. She had just taken the phrase "Non mi dear." "Spare your nerves," Holmes murmured, and he dropped to one knee. I watched him closely, for I knew that his mind, even more than his eyes, was searching. He passed his hand lightly over the boards, sniffed the surface with that curious animal quickness of his, and then drew a lens from his pocket. "What is that?" Lestrade asked, for Holmes had leaned nearer to a small, irregular scratch. "A gouge," Holmes answered. "Not new. See the edges worn by boots, but there is something else." He moved a foot to the right and examined another mark, then another. Presently he rose and took 3 paces forward, stopped, and looked down again. "You observe these, Watson?" I bent to look. There were faint abrasions in the wood, little crescents and bruises as though some hard object had been pressed upward from below. They ran in a rough line, no more than a yard in length, and ended precisely beneath the chalk mark. "They might be from a stage prop," I said doubtfully. "From above?" "No, the fibres are pushed outward. Whatever caused them came from beneath the boards." His eyes went to Lascelles. "Your fiancée heard tapping, you said, when she stood here? This is the testimony of the wood." Lestrade laughed shortly. "Rats again?" Holmes pointed, without answering, to a square seam in the floor, almost invisible amid the dark grain. "A trap?" he asked a stagehand who had approached nervously. "Yes, sir. Old one. We don't use it now, not in Don Giovanni anyway. It leads to the lower service passage." "Open it." The man fetched a key. With a creak and a smell of ancient dampness, the trapdoor lifted an inch, then stuck, as if reluctant to yield its secret. The stage-hand put his shoulder to it, and it came up with a sudden jerk. A draught, cold as cellar air, breathed out upon our faces. I stepped nearer and peered down. A narrow ladder dropped into blackness. The void beneath seemed to swallow the yellow light from above. Holmes knelt again and examined the lip of the opening. "Fresh movement," he said. "The dust is disturbed. Look, there are prints on the inner edge. A boot, heel narrow, toe somewhat scraped." "That could be any of a dozen men who work the traps," Lestrade protested. "Possibly, but not last night. The dust would have settled again by morning. These are within a few hours." Lascelles made an inarticulate sound. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew someone had been there." Holmes's face remained calm, but I saw a quickening in the set of his jaw that told me his interest had sharpened. "We go down," said he. Lestrade frowned. "It's a filthy maze, and there's no need—" "There is every need," Holmes cut in. "The clue which frightened Miss Marchmont may be in those passages. Also, if prussic acid was administered, it was done either from her hand to her mouth or from below her feet to her lungs. I do not propose to ignore either possibility." He swung his legs over the opening and began to descend. I followed at once, for I had learned that when Holmes went down into darkness, it was wise for me to keep at his heels. Lestrade muttered an oath but came after, and Lascelles last, clutching his lantern. The air below was indeed foul and close. Our boots rang softly on stone, and the black vaults above our heads were crossed by beams thick with cobwebs. The lantern's light threw grotesque shadows of our bodies upon the walls, stretching and shrinking as we moved. Here and there a pipe ran, dripping steadily into some unseen gutter. The passage was no higher than a man's shoulders and barely wide enough for two abreast. It smelt of damp timber and forgotten things. Holmes bent over the ground almost at once. "More footprints," he murmured. "Newer than those we saw above. 3 sets at least. 2 men, 1 lighter, 1 heavier, and a third, smaller." "A woman?" I suggested. He did not answer at once. He was examining a faint indentation where the dust had been scuffed away in a short drag. "A case of prussic acid rarely requires a woman's heel," he said at last. "But it may require a woman's glove." We had advanced perhaps 20 yards when the passage forked. One branch led toward the orchestra pit by my reckoning. The other dipped more steeply under the main house. Holmes halted, listening. In the profound stillness of the underworld, the faintest sound seemed magnified. For a moment I heard nothing but the slow drip of water and the far-off muffled throb of a carriage over cobbles. Then, so faint I could not be sure, it seemed to me that there was a soft rustling, as of cloth brushed against stone from the darker branch. Holmes heard it too. I knew by the sudden lift of his head. "Someone is still below," he whispered. Lestrade's hand went to his pocket. "Then we've got him," said he. Holmes's long finger pressed lightly to his lips, and like shadows ourselves we moved down the right-hand passage, the lantern held low, our hearts beating a little faster at the thought of what waited in that blind subterranean throat beneath the opera house. We moved as silently as men may who are unused to stealth, yet the dull stone underfoot and the thickening air helped us by blunting the minor noises of our approach. Holmes had taken the lantern from Lascelles and now carried it in his left hand, shaded by his coat so that only a thin fan of light slid along the ground before us. In that half-gloom I could see the eager line of his figure, head slightly forward, shoulders loose, like a greyhound feeling the leash slacken. The passage slanted downward by uneven steps and then ran level through a low arch of brick. The opera house above us became a mere idea, a weight of masonry that pressed upon the ears. There was no sense of space, save for the narrow tunnel, no light but that which trembled in. Holmes's hand. At intervals, iron brackets jutted from the wall to carry gas pipes, long since cut off, and once we passed a heap of broken scenery, splinters of gilded moulding, a plaster cherub with its face battered in, a canvas cloud streaked by wet. It was as though the discarded dreams of the stage had been thrown down here to rot. Again came the sound we had heard before, more distinct now, a cautious shifting, a faint scrape, then stillness. Lestrade glanced at me with the grim confidence of a man who scents an arrest. Lascelles, behind, kept so close that I felt his breath upon my collar. Holmes halted at the mouth of a wider chamber and held up his hand. The lantern light fell upon a space perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling so low that the beams were within reach. Here the bricks gave way to older stonework, rough and sweating, as if this was some remnant of the cellars that had stood on the site before the Lyceum was rebuilt. A few crates were stacked against the far wall, and beside them an upright piano, its back warped by dampness, and its keys yellow as old teeth. But our attention was instantly drawn to a movement at the right edge of the light. A figure was crouched there, half hidden behind a pillar, a man in a workman's jacket, his cap pulled low. At our sudden appearance, he sprang sideways like a startled cat, and in the same instant Holmes had leapt forward. "Don't move!" Lestrade shouted. The man darted toward a narrow slit of darkness that I now saw to be an opening into another passage. Holmes was too quick for him. He caught the fellow by the shoulder, swung him round, and pinned him with one hand against the damp stone. The lantern lifted, and its flare showed us a face white with terror and grime, young, clean-shaven, the sort of face one sees on 1,000 London lads who have not yet learned to look old. His eyes were wide, his lips working. "It's Billy Harker," Lestrade exclaimed. "One of the trap lads." The youth struggled feebly, then went limp, his breath coming in tight gasps. "I didn't do nothing," he blurted. "I swear I didn't. Don't take me, Mr. Lestrade. It weren't me." "No one has said it was you yet," replied Lestrade sharply. "What are you doing down here?" Billy's eyes kept flicking to Holmes, as if he feared the quiet man more than the loud one. I was looking about," he stammered. "At noon, with the house half shut? Don't lie to me." "I ain't lying. I was told to come." "Told by whom?" The boy hesitated, and Holmes's grip tightened a fraction. "Come now," said Holmes mildly. "We're in a hurry, and I dislike repeating simple questions." Billy swallowed. "Mr. Mortimer?" he said at last. "Mortimer, the stage manager?" "Yes, sir. He sent me down this morning early, said I was to see if any of the old traps needed oiling. He said there'd been complaints of squeaking." Holmes's eyes met mine for a moment, and I read in them that swift, inward note-taking with which he always received an answer. "What time this morning?" he asked. "Just gone 6, Billy answered. "I come in by the back, like I always do." Mr. Mortimer was waiting by the stage. He says, "Billy, you get down and look at number 4 trap. There's a noise there." So I did. Number 4 being the trap under Donna Anna's mark. "Yes, sir." The old one. "I went down, I didn't see nothing, only I thought I heard somebody. So I come out and told him. He said I was a fool, and to go again later when it was lighter. So I done so after breakfast, and I was down here when you came." "You heard somebody the first time?" I said. "Aye, sir, like a man moving about. But when I held the lantern up, there was no one, just shadows." "Were you alone?" Billy's face twitched. "Yes, sir." Holmes leaned closer. "You are lying now." The boy began to tremble afresh. I ain't. "You are. Not a malicious lie, perhaps, but a frightened one. Your left sleeve is wet to the elbow. These passages are dry except where the seep runs near the east wall. You have been in the east corridor. Yet you say you only examined number 4 trap, which opens into the west service line. You have therefore been somewhere you have not mentioned. Why?" Billy's mouth fell open. He stared at Holmes as if at a conjurer. I went a bit further, that's all." "Further to where?" "Just past the old storage. There's a door there, one of the old doors what's been shut for years. I don't know where it goes, but it weren't locked today. So I looked in." Holmes's voice was as even as ever. "And what did you see?" "Nothing much. A stair down, and water on it. I weren't going to fall in, but I heard a sound, like something sliding soft. It give me the creeps, so I come back." Lestrade snorted. "You come back and kept it to yourself?" Billy's eyes filled suddenly. "I told Mr. Mortimer," he said miserably. "He cuffed me and said I was making stories. Told me to shut my mouth if I wanted my job." Holmes released the lad, who sagged with relief. "Where is this door?" he asked. Billy pointed with a shaking finger to the slit of darkness beyond the pillar. "Down there, sir. Second turn to the left. You can't miss it. It's got a rusty iron ring." Holmes nodded as if this were the most ordinary information in the world. "Very good." "You will go back to your work, Billy. And if Mr. Mortimer asks, you saw nothing down here but rats and cobwebs. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The boy backed away, still watching us, and then scuttled off into the gloom as quietly as his fear would allow. Lestrade rounded on Holmes. "You let him go? He was here, sneaking about. That's enough to hold him?" "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but not enough to waste time. If the boy is involved, he will not escape us. If he is not, you would only render him useless as a witness. Also, I suspect Mr. Mortimer would be more valuable prey." "You suspect everyone," Lestrade grumbled. yet his eyes had gone thoughtful. We moved toward the indicated passage. The way grew narrower and the air colder. A thin slime shone on the steps, and I saw by the lantern that the very stones were green with age. Twice we passed shallow pools where water had collected, and once my boot slid on a patch of damp so that I clutched at the wall to steady myself. Holmes showed no hesitation. He trod as lightly as if on a drawing-room carpet, his attention fixed ahead. At the second turn, the corridor ended in a door of heavy oak set into the stone. It was older than the rest of the underworld, its surface worm-eaten, its iron studs eaten red with rust. True enough, a ring hung from it, and the ring had been recently handled. I could see the smear of fresh grease upon it. Holmes set the lantern down and examined the lock. "Not forced," he murmured. "Merely unfastened, and very recently. Observe the dust line upon the jamb." He put his shoulder to the wood. It yielded with a long, complaining groan, and a gust of colder air blew out, carrying with it a smell that was not of the theatre at all, a dank, earthy odour like a vault that has been sealed too long. Beyond was a stair descending into blackness, and along the first few steps a shallow stream of water trickled, glimmering faintly. Holmes took up the lantern again. "This is the Lyceum's cellar within the cellar," said he. "Come, Watson, if our shadow lives anywhere, it is here." We went down single file. The stair was steeper than any we had yet met, and I set my hand against the wall to keep my footing. After 20 steps it opened into a low chamber, so dark that the lantern seemed to make no more than a golden bubble in it. Here the water spread over a stone floor, ankle-deep in places. In the centre stood an object large and shapeless under a tarpaulin. Along one wall were shelves on which lay rotted ropes, broken helmets, and candle stubs. The place had the feel of abandonment so complete that our very breathing seemed an intrusion. Holmes waded forward, lifting the lantern high. Then from somewhere deeper in the black there came a faint, metallic clink, followed by a second, and then a sudden silence that was more ominous than sound. Holmes stood still as a statue. "Did you hear that?" Lascelles whispered. "I did," said Holmes, "and so did the man who made it." He turned his head slightly, listening, and I saw his nostrils flare as he drew the air. "Prussic acid has the scent of bitter almonds," he said softly. "There is a trace of it here. Faint, but fresh." Lestrade's face hardened. "So we're on the right track." Holmes's eyes, bright in the lantern light, moved over the water, the tarpaulin, the far corner, where darkness thickened like velvet. "We are," said he, "and we are not alone on it." For a few heartbeats none of us moved. The lantern trembled slightly in Holmes's hand, and its reflection danced in broken ripples upon the shallow water. I was conscious of the soft patter of drops falling from the ceiling and the slow, sucking sound of our boots in the mire. Yet beneath those commonplace noises there was another awareness, of a presence that had withdrawn into the darkness as a creature withdraws into its hole. I could not have said why I felt it so strongly, but Holmes's whole attitude confirmed my instinct. He had gone as still as a listening cat. Lestrade, less accustomed to such silent duels, made an impatient gesture. "Where are you, then?" he called sharply. "Come out, or we'll smoke you." Holmes's head turned a fraction, and he gave a swift, warning shake, too late. From the far corner there came a splash, a scuffle, and then the quick, retreating slap of feet in water. Lestrade sprang forward with an oath, and I followed, splashing knee-deep. The lantern light wavered wildly, showing only walls streaming with damp and the black mouth of an archway. "He's gone through there!" Lestrade cried. Holmes did not chase at once. He dropped upon one knee at the edge of the water where the disturbance had been and held the lantern low. "Wait," he said. To a policeman, waiting is often harder than running, but Lestrade checked himself with an evident effort. Holmes swept the light over the surface. In the thin layer of slime and silt there were plainly the marks of hasty passage, the long scrape of a heel, the churned-up swirl where someone had pushed past. He studied them for no more than 5 seconds. 2 men, he murmured. One heavier, by perhaps 3 stone. They separated at the arch. The lighter went first. The heavier lingered, perhaps to mislead. "And so?" Lestrade snapped. "And so," Holmes replied, "if you rush into that corridor without knowing its lie, you will either fall into the old sump at 12 yards, or be met by the heavier man with whatever implement he has chosen. Pray allow me to go first." There was something in his voice which brooked no argument. He rose, stepped carefully to the archway, and lifted the lantern to examine its sides. It was a ragged opening cut through thick stone, not part of the theatre's modern works. A dampness as cold as grave earth breathed from it. Holmes stooped and picked something from the wet. He held it up between finger and thumb. "A cigarette end," said he. "Egyptian tobacco, not cheap, and smoked within the hour." Lascelles gave a faint cry. He had come up behind us, pale and shaking. "She hated that smell," he whispered. "Eugenia did. There was one man in the company who always smoked those vile little cigarettes. Mr. Rivington, the baritone. She quarrelled with him more than once." Lestrade stiffened, for the name was familiar to him already. "Rivington," he repeated. "He's been asked to stay in the building for the inquest this afternoon. If he's down here—" "He's not down here now," Holmes interrupted. "The end tells me another thing. It is crimped in such a manner that the smoker holds his cigarette between his teeth rather than his fingers. Your baritone, if I recall, has handsome hands and a habit of gesturing. We will not be led by a brand name alone." Lestrade looked nettled but uneasy, for even he had learned, by painful experience, the dry contempt Holmes held for easy conclusions. We entered the archway. Beyond it, the corridor narrowed to a crawl space, and I was forced to stoop. The water here was deeper and colder. It soaked through my boots until my feet tingled. Twice the passage turned sharply, and at each turn Holmes paused to test the ground ahead with his stick, feeling like a blind man for hidden pitfalls. Once he stopped so abruptly that I nearly collided with him. "Here is the sump," he said, and held the lantern out. I saw a sudden black gap in the floor, a square hole of perhaps 6 feet across where the stone had fallen away into a deeper cistern. A lip of slime made it treacherous. One step too far, and a man would vanish into water no one had stirred in 50 years. "They know their ground," Lestrade muttered. "Yes, which suggests they have practiced in it." Holmes went around the hole with infinite care, and we followed. Beyond, the corridor widened again and rose a little. The air grew less rancid. I could hear, faintly now, the hum of life above. That fact, oddly enough, made the solitude of these burrows feel even more unnatural. We came at last to a junction where 3 passages met. Upon the damp dust at the centre were fresh prints, confused by the haste of those who had made them. Holmes knelt and examined them in silence. "One man went left, back toward the service line," he said. "Heavier. The lighter went straight on. There is a 3rd path to the right unused. Therefore our main quarry is straight ahead." "And the heavier fellow?" I asked. "He wishes us to follow him," said Holmes. "So we shall not, at least not yet." He advanced down the central corridor. It ran perhaps 10 yards and then ended in another door, smaller than the first, but newer, its panels swollen with damp. This time Holmes did not try it at once. He lifted the lantern to the lock. "A warded lock," he observed, "and there is a smear of tallow upon the keyhole. Someone has lubricated it recently. But see here, scratch marks around the escutcheon, very fine. That indicates the use of a skeleton key by one unaccustomed to it. A stagehand might be clumsy. A habitual trespasser would not." He put his ear to the wood. For a moment he listened. "Nothing," he said. And yet his eyes had brightened in that way which meant he had heard more than he admitted. He drew from his pocket a thin strip of metal, one of those ingenious little implements which had more than once opened locks to the discomfiture of the law. In 20 seconds there was a soft click. "Come," he whispered. The door opened upon a chamber that took my breath with sheer unexpectedness. We had been among slime and stone, and now we stood on the threshold of a room as dry and warm as any attic. The walls were brick, blackened by smoke, and the ceiling was arched. A narrow iron stove stood against one side, its ashes still warm. A kettle upon it quivered faintly with the last heat. On a crude table lay a half-eaten heel of bread, a knife, and a cracked mug in which some dark liquid had dried. A coil of rope hung from a peg. A pair of men's boots stood by the stove, and beside them, so grotesque a contrast that I stared, lay the remnants of a woman's stage costume, a lace cuff, a torn ribbon of pale blue silk, and a fan broken clean across. Lascelles made a sound like a man struck. "Her bodice ribbon," he breathed. "I tied that myself yesterday." Lestrade strode forward, his eyes narrowing. "A hideout," he said. "So our man's been living here." Holmes moved not to the bread or the stove, but to a corner where a low pallet had been made from sacking. Above it, pinned to the wall with crude nails, were playbills. Old ones, some dated 2 years back, some newer. Across the face of one of them, in charcoal, had been scrawled 2 words in a large, uneven hand, "Under you." Holmes looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he stooped and picked from the pallet a small object that glittered in the lantern light. "A brooch," he said, handing it to me. It was a little jet ornament in the shape of a lyre, cheap in itself, but carefully kept. On the back were the initials E.M. "Eugenia Marchmont," Lascelles whispered again. "Then she was here," I said. "Not willingly," Holmes replied. "Observe the cords, there and there. They are not stage rope. They are hemp used for binding parcels. See the knots? Sailors' knots, not the sort a theatrical man ties. Our occupant has some knowledge of boats, or cargo." Lestrade had gone to the far wall, where a narrow vent led upward between bricks. "Here's how he watched the stage," he said. "Ventilation shaft. It comes right under the boards." Holmes crossed to it swiftly and peered up. I followed his gaze. To my astonishment, I could see far above a faint square of light where the trap-door lay. The shaft was wide enough for sound to travel, perhaps even for some vapour to rise. "A conduit," Holmes murmured. "For sight, for sound, and possibly for poison." He straightened, and I saw that his nostrils were working again, tasting the air. "Prussic acid evaporates quickly," he said to me under his breath, "yet there is still a trace near the vent. It was introduced here, not above. The singer inhaled it, Watson, through the very boards on which she stood." Lestrade stared at him. "You mean he gassed her from below?" "I mean precisely that. But the question remains, how? Prussic acid does not drift upward in lethal quantity without assistance. There must have been a vessel, a pump, some apparatus. And our lighter-footed friend carried it away when he fled." Lascelles gripped the edge of the table, his face grey. "Who could do such a thing? Why?" Holmes's eyes travelled to the playbills on the wall, to the brooch in my hand, to the stove still warm, and finally to a small smear upon the bricks beside the vent, a smear so slight that I should never have seen it had he not been looking there. He touched it with his finger, sniffed, and smiled, not in mirth, but with that cold satisfaction of the hunter who has found fresh blood. "Why," he repeated softly, "because this was not merely a murder, Mr. Lascelles. It was the silencing of someone who had discovered what lay under her. And if we do not move quickly, the same shadow will attempt to silence all who now stand in this room." The stage hand's cry threw us into motion. We ran along the corridor with the confused, alarmed stir of the theatre swelling around us. The very boards seemed to vibrate with the rumour of fresh disaster. Men and women in rehearsal dress pressed to the walls to let us pass, their faces drawn and pale. One chorus girl was sobbing openly, and a grey-haired violinist stood with his bow still in hand, staring as if he could not reconcile music with murder. Miss Marchmont's dressing room lay behind the second tier of boxes, accessible by a narrow passage that smelt of powder, wet wool, and stale bouquets. The door stood open. Inside, a ring of people had gathered, maids, a dresser, 2 gentlemen of the management. In their midst, upon the floor by the wardrobe, lay a man. He was on his side, one hand clutching at his throat. His face had already assumed that ghastly lividity which I knew too well. A faint froth clung to his lips, and the sharp, bitter odour that rose from him left no doubt of the agent at work. "Stand back!" I cried, dropping to my knees. There was nothing to be done. He had been dead several minutes. I examined his pupils, his pulse, the faint, rigid set of his jaw, prussic again, and in an even more concentrated dose than before. "Who is he?" Lascelles whispered, as though the knowledge might itself be dangerous. A maid answered, her voice shaking. "It's Mr. Mortimer, the stage manager." I looked up sharply. Mortimer, the man who had sent Billy Harker below, the man who had cuffed him into silence, the man who had, by Scanlan's account, been part, wittingly or not, of the chain. Lestrade pushed through the crowd, his hat still on his head, his eyes blazing. "Mortimer!" he snapped. "How the devil—" His gaze swept the room, taking in at once the dead stage manager, the open wardrobe, and, most significant of all, the narrow door behind it, now flung wide. "Holmes!" he cried. As if in answer, there came a quiet voice from the doorway at our backs. "Here I am." Holmes entered without haste, but the way he looked, coat splashed with damp to the knee, collar turned up, eyes bright and hard, told me he had moved quickly in another quarter of the building. Behind him, a stout gentleman in evening clothes was being guided by 2 plainclothesmen. His complexion was bloodless with anger rather than fear, and even in that extremity he carried himself with the offended dignity of wealth. I recognized him from Lascelles' description at once. Selby Vane. "You have exceeded your authority, Inspector Lestrade," he said, in a voice that tried to be calm and could not. I was in my box, awaiting the coroner, when this fellow accosted me in the lobby, and next I find myself treated as some common criminal. Holmes bowed slightly. "I regret the inconvenience," said he. "But in my experience the truly innocent man is less inconvenienced by a few minutes' detention than by a lifetime's remorse. You may sit, Mr. Vane." He drew a chair from the dressing-table and placed it with such quiet mastery that Vane sat as if compelled. Holmes's eyes were already on the open door behind the wardrobe. "Watson," said he, "you and Mr. Lestrade will accompany me down those steps. Mr. Lascelles, you will remain here with Mr. Vane. If he tries to leave, call. He will not get far." Lascelles' face was set like stone. He nodded once. The look he threw at Vane was not that of a man about to argue, but of one who waits for a verdict he already dreads. We went down. The stair was narrow, steep, and wet, and I was struck anew by the audacity of any man who had used it to come and go beneath a busy theatre. Halfway down, Holmes halted and held the lantern to the wall. "Observe," said he, "there were smears of tar upon the stone at shoulder height, and more of that fine, fresh scratching around the old iron latch." "Mortimer was down here today?" I said. "Yes, and he did not come by choice." We reached the lower chamber we had found before. It was changed now. The stove was still warm, but the tarpaulin in the centre had been dragged aside, revealing a narrow crate, such as is used for long instruments or statues. The lid was ajar. Inside lay coils of dark, tarred rope and a canvas sack, its mouth split as if in haste. Beyond, by the vent, a second body lay sprawled. This one, smaller, lighter, the figure of a young man in a stage coat. His head had struck the brick in his fall, and a small pool of blood had spread beneath him. Lestrade let out a low exclamation. "The lad Scanlan spoke of?" he said. Holmes knelt by the body long enough to touch the wrist and glance at the lips. "Dead of Prussic as well," he said. "Given quickly, perhaps within minutes of Mortimer. The shadow has been tidying its work." He rose and went to the open crate. From the sack he drew out something that glinted even in the weak light, a set of silver candlesticks wrapped in old velvet, and beneath them a string of pearls in a cracked leather case. He held them up, turning them so the French hallmarks caught. "Stolen property," Lestrade breathed. "Opera treasures?" "Not from the opera," Holmes returned, "from the houses of those who attend it." He moved to a corner where, half concealed behind rotting scenery, stood a narrow iron trolley with wheels rusted clean but recently oiled. Upon it were faint grains of white dust. "Plaster?" I suggested. "Not plaster, fine lime, such as comes from old cellar walls when one scrapes them to widen a passage." He straightened. "Lestrade, this underworld is not merely for watching singers. It is an artery running from this theatre to something older, something private. A thief's road." Lestrade's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You mean there's a way out to the street?" Holmes pointed to the far wall, where in our first visit there had been only darkness. Now, with the tarpaulin moved, the outline of a low arch could be seen behind stacked boards. A brick had been removed. The air that breathed from it smelt not of theatre but of London earth and coal smoke. "We go through," said Holmes. We crawled under the arch. Beyond was a rough passage, scarcely large enough for a man on hands and knees. It ran straight for perhaps 20 yards, then rose and broadened, ending at an iron grating set into the foundations of what must have been an adjoining building. Holmes put his hand to it. It yielded. He pushed, and we emerged into a small, disused coal cellar under a shop in the Strand. Sacks lay piled, and above our heads we could hear the faint jingling of coins and the creak of a counter. A second door, locked from this side, led to the street. "A private exit," Lestrade murmured. "So that's how they carried things away." Holmes nodded. Now, to complete the circle, we returned to Mr. Vane. We went back through the tunnel and climbed to the dressing room. Vane was still seated, his face more rigid, his eyes darting to each of us as if measuring the distance to safety. Lascelles stood by the door like a sentry. Holmes closed the wardrobe door behind him and set the lantern upon the table. The light fell upon Vane's pale, well-bred features and the fine gloves he had never removed. "You have seen what lies beneath your theatre, Mr. Vane," he said quietly. "You will now explain it." "I have seen nothing but your melodrama," Vane replied coldly. "This is absurd. I know nothing of cellars, tunnels, or murdered stagehands. You drag me here on the word of a Limehouse ruffian and a hysterical conductor." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "The Limehouse ruffian described you with precision. So did your Egyptian cigarettes. So did your habit of wearing gloves underground, which left no fingerprints but did leave telltale tallow on locks, and a thread of kid leather in the vent. If you deny being in those passages, I shall be forced to believe your valet in the Strand has been borrowing your coat, your cigarettes, and your very manner." "I deny nothing that is worthy of denial," Vane snapped. "Yes, I went below. I was curious. The Lyceum is an old building. There are legends. I have a taste for antiquities." "I admire taste," Holmes said, "but not when it is purchased with lives." Vane gave a harsh laugh. "Lives! You speak of lives, you mean her life." His voice shook suddenly, and for the first time the cultured mask slipped. "She was a singer, a pretty one, I grant you, and talented, but her death does not prove I killed her." "No," said Holmes. "Her death proves only that she learned enough to frighten her. It is what she learned that leads to you." He turned to Lascelles. "Tell Mr. Vane about the night 13 months ago when The Tempest was performed." Lascelles blinked. How do you know?" "Tell him." Lascelles swallowed. "There was a robbery that night," he said slowly. "Lady Hatherley's jewels were taken from her cloak in the Grand Corridor. There was a scandal. The police found nothing. We tightened security. It was whispered that the thieves knew the building too well." Holmes nodded. "And during the Huguenots 2 months later there was another theft. A gold snuff box from Lord Evesham. Again no clue. Both nights, Mr. Vane, you were in attendance. Both nights you were seen hovering behind the scenes and speaking with Mortimer." Vane's face had gone whiter still, but he held himself stubbornly. "These are coincidences. I am a patron. I speak with the management." "Coincidences do not leave tunnels," Holmes replied. "Nor do they pay Scanlan to guard a cellar. Here is the truth, Mr. Vane. You discovered, or reopened, an old service passage from the Lyceum foundations to this shop cellar. Through it a man could enter the theatre unseen, reach the corridors behind the boxes, and from there, by an old event system, observe the habits of the fashionable audience. Mortimer, corrupted by your money, arranged distractions, mingled with the press of intervals, the confusion of applause. Your lad, nimble and unknown to the police, slipped through the crush to cloakrooms and private passages. The stolen goods were brought down the wardrobe stair to your chamber and carried away through the Strand exit. A clean, elegant plan. Too elegant for Scanlan, too theatrical for any dock thief. It required someone who knew the opera house, knew society, and knew how to remain a shadow. Vane's lips parted, but no words came. Holmes leaned forward. Miss Marchmont found the wardrobe stair ajar. She heard voices. She suspected Mortimer first, and she spoke to you because you had been pestering her with attentions, and she thought to frighten you into decency. She threatened to tell Mr. Lascelles, perhaps, the police. You could not allow that, but you dared not stab her or poison her in public. So you chose a method no one would suspect, prussic vapor through the stage vent. You hired Scanlan to do the crude part, and you used your lad to time it from above. When she died, you put the threatening note in Lascelles's desk to shift suspicion. It nearly succeeded. Vane shook his head violently now. "You build a story," he cried. "A fantastic story. Where is your proof? Where is your direct link?" Holmes's hand went to his pocket. He drew out a small silver object and placed it on the table. It was a key, dark with age. "This key was in Mortimer's coat when he died upstairs," said he. "I examined him while Watson was confirming death. It fits the wardrobe stair lock, the cellar door below, and the Strand exit. Mortimer carried it because he was summoned down this morning, summoned by you to remove evidence. But he went too far. Perhaps he threatened blackmail once he saw murder added to theft. You silenced him with the same poison you used on the singer because Prussic is quick and leaves little struggle. The lads saw what you did. You silenced him too. Their bodies, their warm stove, their half-finished bread. Those are my direct links. Vane's breath came fast. He looked from the key to Holmes, from Holmes to Lascelles. Something in his eyes collapsed. Some last hope that money or auteur would save him. "You cannot understand," he said hoarsely. "I did not mean to kill her. I meant to frighten her. She was to faint, to be carried off stage, to learn there are limits." She breathed too deep. The acid was stronger than the lad said. He broke off with a sound between a sob and a laugh. "I built it all so carefully. For 2 years. I was tired of being the fool who pays for his pleasures, while dull men grow rich. The theatre offered everything, crowds, chaos, private corridors. It was a game at first, then she found it. She would have ruined me. Adrian would have ruined me. It was easy to think, one breath, and she would be silent." Holmes stood very still. "And now you are not only ruined, but a murderer." Vane's head sank. He covered his face with his gloved hands, and for the first time I saw him small. Lestrade stepped forward, his hand on the man's shoulder. "Selby Vane, I arrest you for the murder of Eugenia Marchmont and others, and for conspiracy to steal." Vane did not resist. He rose mechanically, as if his limbs no longer belonged to him, and allowed the handcuffs to close upon his wrists. When he turned to go, his gaze met Lascelles's. There was no hatred there now, only a dreadful, belated understanding. "I loved her," he said simply, "in my way." "She deserved better than your way," Lascelles answered, and his voice did not tremble. They took Vane away. The little room seemed to expand, as if some foul pressure had lifted from it. A distant burst of discussion sonate. The corridors told that the news was already spreading like flame through dry straw. Yet within this narrow space there was only the quiet breathing of 3 men and the far-off ghostly echo of a piano chord struck somewhere below by the settling of old timber. Holmes was gathering his coat when I touched his arm. "The lighter man? The lad? Who was he?" Holmes paused. "I have a strong suspicion," he said. I found in his pocket a programme clutched like a talisman. The name Harker was written on the back in a woman's hand with a small heart. Billy Harker's brother, I think. Hungry for money, dazzled by Vane's promises and perhaps believing it no worse than stealing from the rich. He timed the vapour. He did not foresee death. When he did, he was trapped in the same net he helped to spread. We walked out through the theatre's back corridors toward daylight. The fog had thinned, and pale winter sun lay upon the cobbles like a reluctant blessing. An ambulance cart stood by the stage door. The constables were already moving with brisk purpose, their earlier confusion replaced by the grim efficiency of certainty. As we reached our cab, Holmes looked back at the great house. Its windows blazed gold in the weak sun. Somewhere within, a soprano was softly running scales, the sound drifting out as pure and indifferent as birdsong. "The opera keeps its secrets beneath the boards," I said, remembering the note. Holmes's mouth curved in that faint, dry line which passed for a smile with him. "Every splendid thing does," he replied. "The question is not whether there is a cellar, Watson, but who is allowed to build in it. When a man of appetite finds a hidden passage, he nearly always convinces himself that his appetite is a virtue." He stepped into the cab and settled back, already abstracted, already moving on. "And poor Eugenia?" I asked. Holmes's face grew grave for a moment. She died because she had courage enough to look down a stair that others ignored. That is a kind of death which shames the living. Come, my dear fellow, London will not pause its crimes because one singer has fallen silent. But perhaps, he added more softly, London will sing a little more honestly for knowing what lay beneath its opera house. The driver cracked his whip, and we rolled away through the brightening streets, leaving behind us the gilded world above and the shadow that had once crept below it.